191 countries belong to the International Monetary Fund. Walk through its door in a crisis and you sign away four things: your budget, your labor laws, your state assets, and your seat at the table where the next conditions will be written. 191 countries have signed. Argentina has signed 22 times. The IMF doesn't own these countries on paper. What it owns is the only door open when a currency collapses and no private lender will answer the phone. The conditions attached to that door were designed in 1944 in a New Hampshire hotel room by a U.S. Treasury official named Harry Dexter White. They require 85% of the global vote to change. The United States holds 16.49% of that vote. Every other country on Earth, voting together, falls short. This isn't a rescue institution with a governance problem. It's a debt collection mechanism designed by the creditor, run by the creditor, and locked against amendment by the creditor's own signature. 80 years, 191 members, one key. Here's how the lock works. It's July 1944. The Mount Washington Hotel sits at the edge of the White Mountains, requisitioned for 3 weeks, sealed off from the press. Inside, 730 delegates from 44 nations. World War II is still burning in the Pacific. But in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the people who will design the post-war financial order are already writing the rules. Two plans are on the table. The first belongs to John Maynard Keynes, Britain's chief negotiator, the most famous economist alive. His country is also, quietly, a debtor. London owes Washington billions in wartime loans. Keynes knows what it feels like to sit on the wrong side of the ledger. His proposal reflects that. He wants a neutral clearing system built around a new international currency he calls the Bancor. The key feature, it would pressure surplus countries, nations running large trade surpluses, like the United States, to rebalance. The burden of adjustment would fall on creditors as much as debtors. The second plan belongs to Harry Dexter White. He works for the U.S. Treasury, and the country behind him holds roughly 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. White's design is simpler and harder. Every country contributes a quota to a shared fund. Quota size determines voting power. Voting power determines control. The burden of adjustment falls entirely on debtor countries. The creditor sets the terms. The math of 1944 made the outcome obvious before the vote. White's plan won. The dollar became the center of the new monetary order. The IMF's headquarters were placed in Washington, D.C., 9 blocks from the U.S. Treasury. The Soviet delegation was there for the full conference. They signed nothing. A Soviet representative later described the new institutions as branches of Wall Street. They weren't wrong, they just couldn't stop it. The Federal Reserve's own published history is direct about what happened. The final agreement resembled the White plan with some concessions. Read that sentence carefully. The concessions were cosmetic. The architecture was White's, quota-weighted, dollar-centered, with the burden of adjustment locked onto the borrower. Keynes flew home and told the British Parliament the new system was fair. He died 2 years later. White's system ran for 80 years. The creditor left Bretton Woods with exactly what it came for. That architecture needed an enforcement mechanism. Here's what they built. Picture a finance minister. It's 2010 or 2018 or 2023. The year doesn't matter much because the scene repeats. She lands at Dulles International with a folder of crisis data and no other options. Private markets have frozen. Her government can't roll its debt. The IMF is the only open door in Washington. What happens inside that door was decided in 1944 by the people who built it. Every IMF member pays into a quota, a financial contribution that doubles as a ballot. The formula that sets each country's quota weights GDP at 50%. Rich countries have more GDP. Rich countries pay larger quotas. Larger quotas buy more votes. The mechanism is self-reinforcing. The countries that need the IMF least control it most. The United States holds 16.49% of total votes. That single number is the architecture. The IMF's Articles of Agreement require 85% approval for every consequential decision. Quota changes, new allocations of the fund's reserve currency, amendments to the charter, expulsion of members. Do the subtraction. 100% minus 16.49% equals 83.51%. Every other country on Earth, voting as a bloc, falls short. The US alone can stop any of it. This isn't a critic's reading of the rules. The Congressional Research Service, Congress explaining the IMF to itself, states it plainly. The United States enjoys effective veto power. That document exists so American legislators understand what their money bought. Now, look at who else is in the room. Advanced economies hold 59.1% of total IMF votes. They represent 13.7% of the world's population. All 54 African member states combined hold less voting power than Germany alone. France's 4.03% share matches the entire voting weight of sub-Saharan Africa. This isn't a proportional system. It's a shareholder meeting, and the shares were distributed in 1944. That's the architecture. Now, here's the contract. All 191 member countries signed the Articles of Agreement. All 191 accepted the 85% threshold. None of them can rewrite it, because rewriting it requires 85% approval, which means it requires the permission of the country the rule benefits. The only exit is full withdrawal from the institution. For a country in a balance of payments crisis, with no other lender available, that exit doesn't exist in any practical sense. Membership isn't voluntary in the way a gym membership is voluntary. It's the cost of operating in the dollar-denominated global economy. One objection comes up every few years. The 2023 quota reform proves the system responds to pressure. It's worth looking at what that reform actually did. Every country's quota increased by 50%. The distribution stayed identical. Each share grew in exact proportion to what it already was. The US stayed above 15%. The 85% threshold stayed in place. A formula that increases everyone's slice by the same fraction changes nothing about who controls the pie. The US can veto its own demotion. That's not a flaw in the design, that's the design. One last thing about the room. Since 1946, the IMF has had 12 managing directors. Every one of them has been European. Not one from Africa, not one from Latin America, not one from Asia. There was never a written rule requiring this. There didn't need to be. The voting math made it unnecessary. The gentleman's agreement runs itself. Knowing who controls the room only matters if you understand what happens when a country walks in desperate. Here's how the door works. Private markets freeze during a crisis. The IMF becomes the only lender. The loan comes with conditions attached. Specific policy targets the borrowing country must hit before each disbursement clears. Miss a target, the money stops. The country has no leverage because it has no money. That's not a negotiation. That's a dictation with a signature line at the bottom. The standard conditions have stayed remarkably consistent across 80 years of programs. Privatize state assets, cut social spending, deregulate labor markets, open the economy to foreign capital. The IMF calls this package structural adjustment. What it produces, reliably, is a fire sale during a house fire. The assets go cheap, the buyers arrive with hard currency. The country gets the invoice. Greece walked through that door in 2010. The crisis started in late 2009, when the incoming government revealed the previous administration had been misreporting its deficit figures. The real number was 15.4% of GDP. The Eurozone's legal ceiling is 3%. Bond markets repriced Greek debt overnight. Within months, Athens couldn't borrow at any rate that made servicing the debt possible. The Troika, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission stepped in with 110 billion euros. The conditions: austerity targets, labor market reform, and a privatization program covering airports, seaports, rail lines, water utilities, electricity infrastructure, and sections of coastline. The IMF projected a 5.5% contraction in GDP and unemployment peaking around 15%. Those numbers turned out to be a significant undercount. The actual contraction was 25% of GDP, roughly equivalent to the United States losing the entire output of California and Texas in the same 5-year window. Unemployment hit 25%. For workers under 25, it reached 60%. Household savings swung from positive 9% of income to negative 9.7%. 12 separate rounds of tax increases and spending cuts followed. The IMF's own independent evaluation office later acknowledged the forecast failed and the program did not achieve its stated objectives. Now trace where the money actually went. An independent analysis of the first 2 Greek programs, 240 billion euros disbursed in total, found that less than 5% reached the Greek government's discretionary budget. The rest went directly to debt service, funds that arrived in Athens and left again within days, landing on the balance sheets of the institutions and banks that held Greek bonds. French and German banks carried roughly 120 billion euros in Greek exposure when the first program launched. By mid-2011, 35 billion euros of that exposure had cleared. The bailout didn't stabilize Greece's economy. It transferred the risk off European bank balance sheets, then left Greece holding a larger debt than it started with. But the money flow is only part of it. The governance transfer is the part that doesn't show up in the headline figures. As a condition of the 2010 program, Greece was required to create TAIPED, a privatization fund that would sell state assets to hit fiscal targets set by the Troika. TAIPED was incorporated under private law, not Greek public law. The parliament in Athens had no oversight authority over its operations. Troika-appointed observers held the explicit right to replace board members who missed targets. Read that again slowly. A body controlling the sale of Greek state assets, with no accountability to the Greek legislature, staffed partly by representatives of the creditors buying the time Greece needed to survive. Greece didn't lose control of its budget. It lost control of the room where the budget was decided. When the IMF's own board voted on the 2010 program, representatives from India, Brazil, Argentina, Russia, and Switzerland formally objected. They said the conditions were too severe and the debt unsustainable. They were outvoted by the European bloc, the same countries whose banking systems held the exposure the program was quietly unwinding. Go back to the voting architecture in Section 2. The outcome of that board vote wasn't a surprise. It was a function of who held the shares. The standard reply to all of this is that countries choose the IMF. Nobody forces them through the door. When private credit markets freeze simultaneously, and there is no other lender of last resort, that choice is theoretical. Argentina has signed 21 IMF arrangements since 1958. The cure keeps producing the next patient. June 20th, 2018. The IMF's executive board approves a $50 billion standby arrangement for Argentina under President Macri. By October, it's augmented to $56.3 billion, 1,277% of Argentina's quota, the largest loan the institution has ever issued. The stated purpose: stabilize the peso, restore market confidence, support reform. $44.5 billion was disbursed. A significant portion of it financed capital flight, wealthy Argentines converting pesos to dollars and moving the money offshore before the exchange rate collapsed further. Public debt climbed from 50% of GDP to 90%. Macri lost the 2019 election. His successor inherited a debt load with no realistic repayment path. The program was formally canceled in July 2020 without meeting its objectives. In December 2021, the IMF published its own ex-post evaluation of the arrangement. The document acknowledged the program was too fragile for such a high-risk scenario. It admitted systematic failures. That's the institution's own language, in its own report about its own largest loan in history. The institution convicted itself, in writing. As of April 2025, Argentina signed its 22nd arrangement, a new $20 billion facility on top of roughly $40 billion still outstanding from 2018. The debt doesn't clear, the conditions don't stop. And layered on top of principal and interest, surcharges. Argentina is projected to pay an estimated $4.9 billion in surcharges between 2024 and 2028. Surcharges are the penalty the IMF charges countries for borrowing too much for too long, the penalty for being too poor to repay on schedule. Ukraine, in the middle of a war, paid $621 million in surcharges between 2018 and 2023. 22 arrangements, 80 years. The mechanism runs. The system isn't broken. It works exactly as Harry Dexter White designed it in that New Hampshire hotel room. Creditors write the rules, debtors follow them, and what looks like a rescue transfers sovereign decision-making to the institution running it. Greece didn't owe the Troika money. It owed compliance over its budget, its labor laws, its asset sales, its privatization board. Argentina doesn't owe the IMF a debt. It owes a schedule. There's a difference between a creditor and an administrator. One wants repayment, the other wants the room. The next time you read IMF approves X billion dollars for country Y, ask 3 questions. Who actually receives the funds? What assets are being listed as conditions? And which countries voted yes? The answers will tell you more than the headline. Reform is mathematically impossible without the permission of the country that benefits from blocking it. That's not a political observation. It's arithmetic. the same arithmetic that's been sitting in the Articles of Agreement since 1944. The lock requires its own key.